This video is going to look at how we analyse structure in poetry. You will get a question on your GCSE literature exam that asks how you can analyse the meaning of the poet from the structure, language techniques and devices in the poems. Structure is one of the first things to look at when you get the unseen poems in front of you, just because it's so obvious what is on the page. As we can see from these two poems, they look very different on the page, and the writer or the poet has done that for a reason, to create meaning of some kind. The first poem, Jumper, obviously has quite long lines and is split up into 3 different length stanzas, and we call this splitting of lines a stanza instead of a verse or a paragraph as you would in fiction. So one of the first things we want to look at is how the poet has split the work up. In Jumper, it's important for us to consider that because actually the break for the stanza shows a change in time as well as a change in meaning. It moves to the poet looking back to their past, and the final break before the last line places particular emphasis on the last line and makes us think that there's something different there. In C, the stanzas are a little bit more regular, except the last stanza is only 4 lines long. Now, these 4-line stanzas we actually call quatrains. Like quarters, there's 4 of them, and often you'll get poems that have quatrains throughout. Here, because one of the stanzas is different from the rest, we want to think about what that does to our understanding of the text. And in the C, it's often to place emphasis on what's going on in the poem. You'll also notice the mixture of long and short lines in this poem, which almost makes the poem look like the tide coming in and out on the page. So often we need to think about these whys in the poem. So the most successful answers for GCSE literature include why a poet does something, not just how they do it and what they do and what techniques they use, but why the writer has written it in a certain way. Although sometimes that may seem like an impossible question to answer, it's one that can be found if you work through the poem and you think about how the poem constructs the ideas that the poet is trying to get across. So in Jumper, for example, we get this feeling of the metronome talked about in the beginning, which is one of those things you get on top of a piano that ticks back and forth and keeps you in time. And the entire structure of the poem feeds into this idea of this regular metronome going back and forth. And that's one of the first things you should look at when you're analysing poetry for GCSE English literature.